All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Center for Faculty Development and Advancement Program, the University of Colorado, Denver. I'm Karen Sobel. I'm the director of the CFDA, and I'm here today with a panel of some of my favorite people at this institution. This is wonderful. Our program today is creating diversity and inclusion statements for faculty. And it is facilitated by Dr. Ronica Rooks, Associate Professor of Health and Behavioral Sciences. Let me turn it over to Ronica. Thank you all. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you all for being here and accepting the invitation to present today, and for our guests as well who come eagerly listening to everyone. I'd like to introduce our guest panel for the day. So we have Dr. Faye, and she is an associate professor and the director of the Ethnic Studies program. She also currently serves as the Chancellor's Faculty Fellow. Her research takes a comparative ethnic studies approach to the understanding of U.S. imperialism. She is the author of Legitimizing Empire, Filipino-American and U.S. Puerto Rican Cultural Critique, and is currently researching the different and unequal citizenship statuses afforded to residents of U.S. territories. Our second speaker on the panel is Manuel, or Dr. Manuel Luis Espinoza. He is an associate professor in the School of Education and Human Development and director of the Right to Learn Dignity Lab, a graduate research project now entering its 15th year in existence. Dr. Espinoza is an anthropologist of education who studies dignity and human learning. He is also a Denver native, born on the 5th floor of Denver General Hospital and raised in 5 Points in Curtis Park. We have our final speaker on the panel, and that's Dr. Dominic Martinez, and he is Senior Director of the Office of Inclusion and Outreach at CU Anschutz. Thank you, and to you all, and welcome. And the order of presentation we'll have with Dr. Caronan first, and then we'll just go in alphabetical order with the speaker.
Thank you, Ronica, and I agree with Karen. I'm presenting with some of my favorite people on this campus. It's an honor to be on the panel with Dr. Martinez and Dr. Espinoza. Okay, let me share my screen real quick. Okay, so today I'm going to, kind of briefly talk about my process when I am writing DEI statements and how I approach them. And I'll also be sharing an assessment that folks at UC Berkeley use to, to evaluate DEI statements, and, how you might use those assessments to in your approach to creating your own DEI statements, so that you can see kind of the range of going from the very general type of DEI statements to more particular specific ones. Okay, so when I approach a DEI statement, I think about it in terms of storytelling, how you tell your DEI journey. And I think about this in 3 different parts. Usually I will start off by talking about why DEI work is important to me. Sorry, I have little ones running around here, so you're going to hear their voices in the background. And then you tell about how you have incorporated DEI into the work that you do on campus. And then I recommend ending your statement by talking about what DEI projects you hope to do in the future. So I've actually been writing DEI statements for a very long time. I realized while I was putting this presentation together, when I have my PhD in ethnic studies, and I realized that personal statement that I wrote when I was applying to graduate school was very much a DEI statement. I began by talking about why, in that case, ethnic studies and the work that ethnic studies does was important to me. And that had a lot to do with, why, how I came to understood structural inequality in the United States and what I hoped, the work that I would do would address that. And, you could go about this, talking about how you began your DEI journey in different ways. You could talk about the broader significance, how DEI work is important, for different types of marginalized groups and how you came to understand that. Or you could incorporate also parts of your personal experience. If you, at some point, that point in your life where you realize that you were a part of a marginalized population, and connect that into, why you do the DEI work that you do, why you think it is so important. And again, like I said earlier, I'm going to be sharing assessment examples. And, I think that this is from UC Berkeley, their Office for Faculty Equity and Welfare. And their different assessments map on to, approaching a DEI statement as your DEI journey really well. So the first thing they look for is your knowledge about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you'll see that, that their scores go from, whether or not you are aware of things like structural inequality in higher ed, and then how deep your understanding is. So I think that maps really well into that personal story of how you came to understand that. Again, the more particular and specific you are, the better. Since we're all in higher ed, if you could apply that into higher education, then it becomes very clear that you are connecting your DEI journey to the work that you're doing at the university. And then the next part, and I think for me, this has always been the chunk, what I think of as the bulk of a DEI statement, the DEI work that you do. And, as faculty members, that means that we're looking at it from the different parts of our job description: research, teaching, and service. So for research, you might be thinking about how your research provides a better understanding of historically marginalized groups. Or you might talk about the impact that your research has for diversity, equity, and inclusion at the university or beyond the university. For teaching, really, there's a very wide range of activities that can fall within DEI work. If you are mentoring students of color or students from other marginalized groups, first generation students, you could talk about accessibility. If you're teaching an online class, or even if you're using Canvas as a companion to your remote classes or your on-campus classes, and you could talk about have you made all of the documents on there accessible for all of your students? You could also talk about inclusive pedagogy. How do you encourage students to come into your class and participate in your class as their most authentic selves? Do you have a DEI statement in your syllabi to try to foster that type of environment? And then lastly, if you teach, diverse course content. So, I'm in ethnic studies, and that's basically, one of the main goals of our department. So you could talk about how you teach diverse course content and how that serves the mission of your college or the university at large. And then the last part with service, you could look at the committee work you do. Are you on any DEI committees on campus? Right now there are over 100 people participating on the equity task force and the subgroups underneath the task force. You could talk about committee service, even at your department level, how maybe you introduced inclusive pedagogy to your department, how you're doing it in your class and sharing it with the rest of the department. You could also talk about your community partnerships, what you're doing within the community. Perhaps you are, trying to create pipelines for first generation students into your department or your college. You could talk about those community partnerships. And I think something that often falls off the radar are support systems that folks create for that are often seen as unofficial. So you might have, say a group of other a faculty of color, and you meet for happy hour, every other week, and you create that support system that you might not have in your own department. That work is also vital because it helps with retention of faculty of color. So I would include those types of support systems that you're building with other people across the university. And I'm going back to the Berkeley assessment here. This gives you some idea of how the folks at Berkeley look at and assess one's track record, the work that one does in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you'll see that again, if you're aiming for that 4 to 5, it's basically you're getting into the specifics of the work you do and the impact that it has. Lastly, I like to end a DEI statement by talking about your future DEI projects. If you're writing a DEI statement, it's probably because you are, you need the DEI statement because you're going up for an award, or you are, going up for a merit review, or perhaps you are trying to, be promoted into another position at the university. So it's really important there to think about the purpose of your DEI statement. If you're going up for a promotion, you should understand how that new position will allow you to incorporate DEI in a different way and have a different impact with different communities on campus. Or if you are going up for, say, a DEI award, you might talk about how you will continue and expand the current work that you're doing in your current role. And that work would also require you to inventory ongoing DEI initiatives. So you could talk about how you connect to different initiatives on campus and how you might amplify your impact, either in your current role or in the role that you're hoping to get. And, again, you also identify potential partners for your goals. And I would say in that, as you're projecting yourself into the future, to think about what you hope to achieve in the next 2 to 5 years, so that, I'm going to go to the next slide. And that's, again, to just show that level of detail, that you've really thought about what impact you're hoping to have, and that you have a clear plan on how to achieve that impact. I want to leave a lot of time for questions at the end, so I'm going to stop there so we could listen to the wisdom that my other panelists are going to impart to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Faye. I'm next, correct? Yes. Yes. So, very nice to be here with you all. I certainly wish it could be person to person. Let's just keep safe, everyone, and keep hoping for those double dose vaccination rates to go up. I have I think probably a slightly different approach to the diversity, equity, inclusion statement. I see them differently. I see them as really true markers of the self. Statements regarding the kind of person that you have been and the kind that you are trying to become. I work in a department in which I think this language of equity, diversity, inclusion, that it has come to be somewhat generalized. And so, when I have colleagues who talk about that stuff in faculty meetings or on their merit review, on their tenure packet, they're not really about that. They haven't given their life to something like this, but they have become adept, I think, at using the language. And so, they can sort of they can fool the person who really doesn't know. But let's say that you have given your life to something like this, to the promotion of diversity, equity, inclusion, dignity, whatever it may be, the pursuit of justice in a particular field of social life. Well, I think what's important in these statements is to show one's personal history with respect to all of these things, and in that, I think, you can make really, really powerful use of the first person voice of the I. And there's always a temptation there, right? There's always a kind of a difficulty, a peril that lies ahead, that you can be, you should be candid, right? In terms of your personal history with respect to these issues. But you don't want to treat the document as as a chapter in your memoir, right? So there's a balance there. So you want to be more descriptive, I think, than theoretical. Again, this gets back at the language for me, so I'll give you an example really quick before sort of developing the line of thought. Faye mentioned, inclusive pedagogy, right? Well, I have folks in my department, who talk that language, and when they use it, it seems like they think that it sort of ends the conversation, right? That if I can say that I practice inclusive pedagogy, well, that's it. The argument is over. The case has been argued, and now it's done. Well, maybe for them, not for me. However, that begins the conversation, right? Because then I want to know exactly. I want to know how it is that you do that. So I think you want to err. This is my perspective. I think you want to err on the side of being more descriptive than theoretical. Talk about what it is that you've done, not what you promised to do, right? But what you've done. And within that, I think there's a lot of room for nuance and complexity there. I've been, I started working with young people in California about 20 years ago. Members of the migrant community, right? The sons and daughters of California's itinerant workforce. And I have to tell you that on the outside, someone looking in could say, Manuel is really committed. He loves these young people and he is giving of his entire self. Sure, I could see that maybe, but on the inside, there was a great deal of reluctance alongside those actions, right? I had never been part of something like that, I had been something of a student activist in my undergraduate days, and I was always aware of these things, right? But that was the first time in my life that I had really committed full-fledged to something like that. And for me, it's important to talk about how at the same time that I was doing the things that were necessary to promote this different kind of community, to build this different kind of community, I was also at the same time somewhat reluctant, right? Because a part of me was thinking like, can I really do this? Do I really want to do this? Because I was seeing that the work was going to cost a lot in terms of effort, in terms of time. So, I think there's room to talk about sort of the difficulties of enacting these commitments. There's room to talk about what it is that I learned, most definitely. I think there's room to talk about where I fell short. That kind of paves the path for the next thing that you do, right? Because no one develops like this, right? No one develops on a straight sort of, ever rising inclination, It's not like that. It goes back and forth. There's reluctance, sometimes there's a step backward for every 3 that you gain and vice versa. That's part of the story of these commitments as well. But, to talk about how you went perhaps, your own arc of development or your own path of development with respect to these issues, I think it can be quite powerful in a narrative, right? Especially with respect to, the surface stuff is the merit review. The surface stuff is tenure. The surface stuff really is the occupation, right? The thing that really matters is what it is that you've become and what you've given your life to, and how other people perhaps have benefited from your choices and your assistance, right? to talk about how these things have vivified you, to talk about how these things have now animate your life. I think that's really, really vital. And let's just say again, you have to think about, what if you get a reader like me, someone who kind of knows, someone like Faye who knows, someone like Dominic who knows. You can kind of see through the sheen and the veneer of things. I think it's better to talk about sort of, if your efforts have been somewhat limited to this point, to say that, but to highlight as much as you can what it is that you've actually done. That way the promise to do more, the promise to do better, I think suddenly has some substance. So that's my particular take on the diversity, equity, inclusion statement. And I will cede the floor for my good friend and colleague, Dominic Martinez.
Thank you so much, Dr. Espinoza. I'm going to go ahead and share with you all some slides. So hopefully you're all able to see this. But I'm kind of taking the approach of both, and in a lot of ways, I think what Faye and Manuel have both said are very powerful, and really bring together this idea of what it really means for a diversity statement, and this idea of creating a diversity statement in these times. The use of the term of diversity can mean many things to many people, but I think it's been overused, and this has been vague in a lot of ways. So I really encourage a lot of you, as you're getting started and really looking at, what does this mean? What does diversity mean to me? And how does it interact with equity? How does it interact with inclusion? How does it interact with all the other terms that are being thrown around? How does it interweave in that? And really, institutions of higher education are becoming more intentionally and more intentional and around how they're embracing these principles of diversity, equity, justice, and throughout campus life. So kind of get an understanding of how are they defining it though too, because working on a medical campus, and then also working on a undergraduate campus, there's different departments, different leaders that are viewing inclusion, diversity, equity, all in different ways. So just being able to have a clear understanding of how are you defining it, what does it mean to you, and then I also find out, how is the institution defining it. And I think the biggest thing is more focus on finding faculty who have experience and competencies that can contribute to these efforts. This is why campuses are wanting to really put in place this idea of a diversity statement, when they're hiring faculty, when they're even hiring staff now. I'm seeing it more and more, where where some of the questions that are being asked on some of the applications for staff positions in student affairs, in academic affairs, in some of our diversity positions, is asking about diversity statements. How is that really empowering you? So it really gives you this opportunity to demonstrate your commitments and capacities to contribute to the institution's projects of inclusion and equity. And it could be through scholarship, it could be through teaching, it could be through service, mentoring, advising, it could be through all these different ways, but it's really how you're going to be able to put that down into paper. What topics might be included in a diversity statement? I think Faye has really put those out there already about the statements of values. How does your statement align to the commitment of diversity, equity, and our justice of the institute you're applying to? So this is something I've always told people. I always tell myself though too, if your values don't align with the values of the institution you're applying to, it's probably not going to be a good fit though. So you need to be honest with yourself though too. So when you're putting together this statement, and if it's not meeting with the alignments of the institution, then it might not be a good fit. Use examples of experiences. Show how you've been committed to fostering success of underrepresented students, faculty, staff, peers, and show how you've done this in the classroom, lab, campus, or even in the community, and how you'll continue to advance this inclusive work in the future, in the research and teaching or in service. I know one of the big things, and this has been talked about for so long, but I'll believe it when it happens, but tenure, when they'll start counting diversity as part of the tenure process. I think it's important that it needs to be a part of that. I know one of the things we're talking about at Anschutz and might become a requirement eventually is diversity, equity, and inclusion being included in the performance plan of our faculty and staff. But having something that is value, that's there, that says, these are what we value as an institution, so then our employees then value that same thing. This is kind of what can a diversity statement include? And it's really your own experiences of and with diversity. Your representation of diversity in course materials, how you've managed the classroom and interpersonal interactions, and how you work towards equity and social justice in and out of the classroom. So your own experience is really one of the key factors. And I think Dr. Espinoza really touched on that when he talked about, you talk about your lived experiences. It's the lived experiences. And then Faye talked about how are you presenting that within your classroom? How are you sharing that within the materials? And then how have you been able to really manage the interpersonal interactions within the classroom? How are you able to demonstrate that within your statement? These lived experiences, it's an opportunity to highlight your understanding of the barriers you faced. Are even the areas that you've been able to work with groups that who have had to overcome barriers. These life experiences could be first generational students, it could be ethnic, it could be race, it could be urban, rural, it could be communities that speak multiple languages. I think for so long, higher education has had this idea of deficit thinking when it comes to these areas. Like we right away think that, oh, these are deficits, first generation students are at risk, our diverse students bring at risk issues, our students who are multiple language speakers are risk students. There's so much literature out there that have been quoted way back in the days about our at-risk youth and coming from these communities and stuff. But I think we need to change how we think about that, and really, as you're writing these statements, look at what are the benefits that these populations are, what are the benefits of these students who've overcome these barriers? What have they brought into the classroom? And I think something that's really important for you is that what you bring to the table, and it's really about being proud of it and sharing it. Some of the most common pitfalls, I think, is when viewing diverse students' perspectives as something you need to fix. That's one of the things, we have this deficit thinking, we have this let's be the saviors of these groups of students, or let's write this statement from a savior point of view. Not understanding the organization's view of diversity. I think when I first joined CU, it took me a while to understand what our view of diversity was. So I think it's important to also ask people, like, what is the view of diversity? And then using diversity as a buzzword rather than unpacking the meaning of different terms. And not providing examples or providing inappropriate examples. I think in anything, when you're writing your statements, I think you should use your voice. I think it's writing from your perspective and sharing your experiences are very important. And that's as someone who sit on a lot of search committees and who is also a trained search advocate for our institution, I see the importance of these diversity statements, and I'm more drawn in by those who are writing from their own personal experiences and that are being honest and truthful and sincere about their experiences. So that's kind of where my thoughts are around diversity statements and how you should be looking at creating diversity statements. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our host, who will have some questions.
Thank you, Dominic. I appreciate it. So, any questions that are coming from the audience?
I will stop the recording at this point so that we can talk very freely.